Chapter 1. The Forbidden Map. The fluorescent lights of the underground archive buzzed with an irregular flicker, as though resisting illumination. Dust danced in the thin shafts of light, undisturbed for decades. Dr. Elara Voss moved like a shadow between the rows of sealed crates and brittle filing cabinets, the sound of her boots echoing against the cold stone floor of the facility, buried deep beneath the former SCP Foundation site in Reykjavik. She wasn't supposed to be here. No one was. After the collapse, the Foundation's more dangerous containment zones were buried or abandoned, especially those dealing with cognitohazards. Elara, however, had spent a decade studying thought contagion, forbidden linguistics, and memory paradoxes. To her, the line between academic and heretic was a matter of documentation, and the document she now held was not supposed to exist. A yellowed scroll, bound with what appeared to be a strip of cured human skin, pulsed faintly in her latex-gloved hands. It radiated heat, like a coiled animal breathing just under the surface. The only writing visible on the outer layer was in Latin, "Cavete cogitationem quae face insulum respirare." Beware the thought that makes the island breathe. She should have walked away, burned it, sealed the vault, prayed to whatever god still answered through the haze of fractured cognition. Instead, she unwrapped it. The map depicted an island unrecorded by any cartographer, a jagged shape floating in a void with no coordinates. The surrounding waters were inked in fine strokes of screaming faces, eyes bulging, mouths open mid-thought. Above the island's heart was a symbol she knew only from Foundation blacklists, the sigil of SCP-3125, the entity that existed only in thought, only in minds, only in language. She did not scream, not when the scroll wept black fluid that hissed and burned the table beneath it, not when the room's temperature dropped by 10 degrees. Not when her shadow detached and stared at her from the ceiling, whispering in inverted Latin. Instead, she smiled. By nightfall, her preparations were complete. She chartered a small vessel under the guise of a geological survey and assembled a tight-lipped crew. Matteo, a former expedition medic with a tremor he never spoke of, Liu, an engineer fluent in 7 languages, 3 of them dead, and Kaspar, a mute mercenary with a ritual-scarred face and a twitchy hand that never left his thigh holster. They set sail from the Icelandic coast under a roiling black sky, the waves unusually still, as if the ocean held its breath in dread. By the 3rd day, the instruments failed. Compasses spun in defiance. Radios emitted only static, interlaced with murmured phrases none could translate. The stars disappeared. Then, on the 4th dawn, the island rose out of the mist like a wound punched into the ocean. It looked wrong, not just in structure, but in concept. The horizon bent toward it. The trees grew in geometries not meant for this world, branch angles impossible under Euclidean laws. A dull humming sound permeated the air, coming not from the island, but from inside the minds of the crew. Kaspar vomited black bile over the railing. Matteo wept silently, staring into the jungle with eyes dilated to the whites. Liu clutched her translator necklace as if it might somehow shield her from the meaning that bled from the very foliage. When they stepped ashore, the sand beneath their boots vibrated subtly like the rhythm of a heartbeat, but not human. Elara led the way up a narrow path flanked by crooked statues, misshapen human-like figures with melted features and mouths sewn shut with gold wire. A rusted plaque embedded in one read, "Silentia, vivat, silence lives." They found the first corpse 20 minutes inland. It had no face. Not torn off, not decomposed. Erased. The skin where the face should have been was smooth and unbroken, as if the idea of a face had been scrubbed from existence. Its hands were clenched around a notebook filled with symbols that swirled in place, refusing to be read. Matteo tried to pry the notebook free. The moment his fingers touched the cover, he froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then, slowly, his eyes rolled back. His body lifted several inches off the ground, limbs stiff, head tilted toward the canopy. And then it started. The tearing was invisible. One moment he was whole. The next, Matteo's body began to unravel, not in flesh, but in definition. Lines blurred, he pixelated, smeared like wet ink. His scream echoed half-formed, guttural, and distorted. By the time it was over, nothing remained but a faint imprint in the soil. His outline etched into the dirt like a scorch mark, eyes wide, and frozen in final understanding. Caspar raised his rifle and shot the notebook. It didn't burn, it didn't shatter. It simply deceased, as though the bullet unthought it. Silence followed. Elara stood still, breathing heavily. A tremor in her hands betrayed the calm on her face. "We move forward," she said coldly, voice flat, like she were speaking through a wall of thick glass. The others stared at her, but followed. They had no choice. On this island, thought was the enemy, and it was watching. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2, Island of Whispers. The jungle swallowed them. As the 3 remaining members of the expedition pressed deeper into the island's interior, the foliage grew denser, less like trees and more like thoughts given organic form. The leaves shimmered with oily iridescence, edges too sharp for natural growth. Ferns whispered as they passed, in voices just low enough to remain indistinct. No animals stirred, no birds cried. The only sounds were the rustle of alien flora and the crunch of dead flora beneath their boots, and the murmurs. Those damned murmurs. It began as a susurrus just behind the ears, like memory echoing too loudly. By midday the whispers had shape, voices they recognized. Elara heard her father, dead a decade, reading bedtime stories in reverse. Liu clenched her jaw as her childhood math teacher recited non-Euclidean theorems she'd never learned. Caspar, while he didn't speak, but every few minutes he'd flinch as though slapped, his one eye twitching violently, his hand brushing his holster. They reached a clearing rimmed with statues. These were different from those near the shore, taller, more detailed. They depicted humans mid-speech, one mouth stretched too wide, another with dozens of tongues unfurling like wet ribbons, a third bent backward at an impossible angle, a silent scream, frozen in stone. Each wore a placard etched with strange glyphs, pulsing faintly beneath a layer of moss. The air smelled of scorched hair and spoiled meat. At the clearing's center stood a stone monolith, 10 feet tall, covered in the same writhing symbols that refused to be interpreted. The monolith pulsed once, and the jungle shivered. Liu stepped forward, pulled a handheld scanner from her belt, and began taking readings. The device emitted a shriek and exploded in her hands, embedding jagged plastic into her forearm. Blood welled up, dark and thick, and she let out a low gasp of pain. Caspar rushed to her side, attempting to staunch the bleeding with a torn sleeve. That's when the jungle spoke back. The ground beneath the monolith cracked with a sharp snap, and something emerged. A figure, emaciated, skin translucent and vibrating, as if it were caught mid-space between reality and imagination. Its face was an ever-shifting blur of features, never quite resolving into a form. Eyes formed and vanished. Mouths opened in silence. Its limbs bent too many ways. It didn't attack, it thought. A pulse of psychic static hit them like a concussion. Elara screamed as images not her own flooded her mind. Births, deaths, atrocities, all unfolding within a blink. Her nose bled, her legs buckled. Caspar reacted first. He drew his sidearm and fired. The bullets did not impact. They unmade. With each shot, Part of the entity flickered, distorting like a corrupted video file. But it didn't die. Instead, it retaliated. The creature's form twisted into a recognizable face, Caspar's own. It spoke without sound, lips moving in mirror-perfect imitation. The moment he looked into its eyes, his hand spasmed. His weapon fell. He staggered back, mouth agape, pupils dilating. Then he began to speak. Not words, not language, just raw sound. A gurgling, phlegm-clotted stutter that tore through the air like a bone saw. His throat bulged. His lips cracked open at the seams, split and dripping red. Teeth shattered with the pressure. He screamed as his own voice broke him, blood erupting from his ears, eyes, pores. Liu dragged Elara away, even as Caspar collapsed, thrashing, body convulsing in a seizure of sound until he was nothing but a twitching mass. Then, silence. His chest stopped rising. His mouth remained open. Inside, something still whispered. The entity watched them. Elara, barely conscious, choked out, "Don't think it's shape." Liu, shaking and half delirious from pain and shock, yanked a flare from her belt and ignited it. The sudden bloom of firelight sent the thing reeling into the shadows, form unraveling into streams of vibrating thought. They ran, through vines that reached like hands, through trees that seemed to shift positions when not observed, through clouds of spores that whispered names only they should know. Eventually, they stumbled into a hollow surrounded by stone ruins. Walls caved in. Machinery rusted into grotesque sculptures. It looked like a research outpost, long abandoned and nearly devoured by the jungle. Faded SCP logos etched into crumbling walls confirmed it. Liu collapsed by an overturned desk, cradling her bleeding arm. Elara dropped beside her, chest heaving, eyes wide. The walls here were covered in equations, containment protocols, and handwritten notes, all scrawled in looping spirals and recursive symbols. On a shattered screen, a phrase blinked in endless repetition. SCP-3125 is an idea. Do not think it. Do not speak it. Do not understand it. Eara's mind reeled. Every word they read, every name they spoke was a weapon against themselves. The island wasn't cursed. It wasn't haunted. It was the curse. And now it knew they were here. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Archive of the Mind. The ruin was silent, entombed in a stillness so absolute that even their breathing felt like blasphemy. Rain began to fall, slow and warm, dripping from the fractured ceiling onto rust-streaked machinery that groaned with memory. This was no ordinary facility. This was where the veil between language and reality had been deliberately peeled back, where the SCP Foundation had dared to look into the mind of a god and tried, insanely, to weaponize what they saw. Elara forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling, soaked with sweat and rain. Her hands clutched the flare, its glow flickering weakly. Leo sat slumped against a console, feverish from blood loss, eyes darting as if trying to swat away hallucinations only she could see. The interior corridor stretched downward at an unnatural angle, as if the facility had begun to sink into the earth and had been halted mid-submersion. Along the walls, graffiti in a dozen alphabets merged and warped. Cyrillic bled into Arabic, kanji twisted into English, ancient Sanskrit twisted around phonemes that didn't exist in human throats. Elara touched the wall. Her mind shuddered. Images hit her like a tsunami. Screaming faces, sealed behind glass. A man tearing his eyes out with tweezers while murmuring it's inside the syntax. A woman writing the same sentence until her fingers snapped from repetition. It reads us. It rewrites us. She recoiled, vomiting onto the floor, bile and blood mixing. They descended. Door after door lined the hallway. each reinforced with layers of lead, sigils and warning labels. Memetech, Class, Omega, Auditory Kill Hazard, Agent inside. Most were sealed, but one had been forced open from within. Inside was a theater, a tiered observation chamber built like a miniature lecture hall, rows of seats arranged in concentric arcs around a central platform. The seats were filled with corpses, skeletal now, all wearing the same expression. Wide eyes, jaws broken open as though screaming in recursive silence. Some had crushed their skulls against the seat backs. Others had chewed through their own tongues. Leo looked away. Elara stepped forward, drawn to the center. There, a podium, charred, cracked, held a glass orb. It pulsed faintly. The surface shimmered with impossible reflections, not of them, not of the room, but of thoughts. She could see thoughts inside it. Not memories, thoughts. Raw, flayed cognition, looping in containment like beasts in a cage. Concepts twisted into violent shapes, too dense for minds to hold without breaking. One spun slowly within the sphere, a sigil of SCP-3125, floating like an infection looking for a host. A data console blinked to life as she approached, the screen jagged and stuttering, as though unwilling to display the information it contained. Adject, Kulnisphere, mental weaponization of Med-A-Lead 3125. Subject Alpha 9 initiated exposure via phonemic simulation. Target collapsed within 3.2 seconds. Neurographic scan revealed cortical melting, semantic overload. Memory ejection began before death. Subject Beta 3 lasted 12 seconds. Recited anti-thought mantras. Unsuccessful. Speech organs inverted. Entity is self-aware. No longer passively hostile. It learns. Each exposure strengthens it. Elara's breath caught. This wasn't just research. This was experimentation. The Foundation hadn't simply studied the island. They'd brought SCP-3125 here. Tried to shape it. Direct it. They'd failed. On the far side of the room, a locked case bore a retinal scanner. The glass cover was cracked, but intact. A placard beneath it read, "Toxic anger, the oblate of script." Delia, half-conscious, pointed at it with her good arm. "I'd not take Joe," Olo said. "Anti-concept language. A way to neutralize memetic contamination." Elara didn't hesitate. With a rock, she smashed the glass. Inside were etched metallic sheets, thin, with writing that seemed to writhe as she tried to focus. The characters evaded comprehension. They refused meaning. That was the point. The moment she touched them, the whispering stopped. Total silence. The script was the cognitive equivalent of blindfolding the brain, severing the pathway by which SCP-3125 could read or alter thought. It offered a crude barrier, temporary protection, like wearing conceptual armor. But the silence didn't last. A sound cracked through the chamber, a scraping, dragging, slithering. From behind the seats, something emerged. Not a creature. A projection, a sculpture of darkness given hunger and form, its edges frayed, bleeding smoke, yet its shape was sharp, angular, digitized like corrupted code. Its face was a screen. On it, Elara saw her own image, reflected, warped, flickering. It lunged. She ducked just in time, the entity crashing into the console, sending sparks and shards across the room. Leo screamed. The thing turned toward her. Elara moved without thought. She grabbed one of the etched plates and slammed it into the entity's face. It screamed. Not sound, but reality screamed. The air split open like tearing fabric. The walls bent inward. The corpses in the seats rose, levitating, twitching like marionettes, as if remembering their deaths. The entity convulsed, flickering madly, its form breaking apart into symbols and static. Then it vanished, sucked backward through the floor like smoke being vacuumed into another plane. Silence again. Only the flickering of failing lights remained. Elara dropped the plate. Her hands bled from where the metal had burned her palms. Liu sobbed quietly, clutching her side, her lips torn from biting down during the attack. This place was not a lab. It was a graveyard. A graveyard for ideas too dangerous to be spoken. Elara rose. They weren't alone on the island. And SCP-3125 was no longer asleep. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Thoughts that kill. They slept in shifts, if sleep could even be called that anymore. The oubliette plates had been arranged into a crude perimeter around the room, a mental firewall of sorts. The moment the last plate had touched the floor, the whispering retreated, as though the jungle itself had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. Liu lay curled beneath a rusted terminal, wrapped in a thermal sheet, her lips stained with blood and bitten flesh. Elara sat vigil, staring at the remains of the shattered console and the images that still flickered across a broken screen. She hadn't closed her eyes in over 20 hours. She couldn't risk what she might see. As dawn, or whatever passed for it under the choking mist canopy, crept in through the crumbled ceiling, the silence grew heavier. Not peaceful. Not dead. Expectant. Elara flipped through the remaining logbooks they'd scavenged. Most were gibberish, pages of recursive phrases, looping sentences like Mobius strips. But one log, dated 6 days before the facility was abandoned, had clarity. Entity is now fully cognizant of its containment. It speaks through hallucination. Thought itself is the battleground. Language has become a battlefield. Survival requires not thinking its name. We are losing, I can feel it, inside the grammar. Now the page. To survive, we must learn to speak the anti-thought. Silence is no longer defense. Silence is a signal. It knows the empty spaces. Elara felt a chill as the truth settled like wet ash in her lungs. Their silence hadn't protected them. It had only made them more visible. They needed to speak, but carefully. Words, she realized, were the scalpel and the grenade. She shook Leo awake, gently. "We're going deeper," she said. "We need containment data, weapons, answers." Liu's face was pale, soaked with fever sweat, but she nodded. Her grip on the makeshift spear she'd fashioned from a broken pipe and wiring was tight. "What's the plan?" "Talk," Elara replied grimly, "but never mean anything." They pushed through a sealed door at the far end of the research block, an airlock of sorts. The bulkhead had been reinforced, but something had torn through it from the inside. Scrape marks raked deep into the steel. Behind it lay a stairwell that descended far below sea level. The walls were lined with lead and etched with glyphs that rippled if stared at too long. Along the descent the air grew thick, molasses-like, as if saturated with sound that couldn't escape. At the bottom they emerged into a vault. Rows upon rows of cylindrical tanks lined the chamber, filled with a viscous black fluid and the floating remnants of minds. Not brains. Minds. Flickering silhouettes twisted and screamed inside each tube, mouths moving in frantic silence. Some still wore lab coats, their faces half dissolved. Their thoughts turned inward until there was nothing left but reflection and madness. One tank was cracked. The body inside had broken free, but not fully. It had left something behind. A smear of thought trailed across the floor, like blood that bled ideas. Symbols bled out of it like smoke. And then they heard the laughter. It came from nowhere and everywhere, not human, not even animal, a thought laughing at itself, a concept amused by its own definition. A voice followed, not spoken but embedded directly into their cognition. You gave me shape, you gave me name, you gave me audience. The walls trembled. Suddenly, Liu dropped her weapon and screamed. Her body locked rigid, as if every nerve had been supercharged. Her lips moved against her will, forming shapes Elara didn't recognize, impossible syllables that carved into the air like claws. She fell to her knees, blood spraying from her mouth as her vocal cords tore themselves apart in an effort to speak a language not made for her biology. Elara lunged forward, slapped her hard, and shouted, "Unmean it!" Liu gasped. Her eyes cleared. The sound ceased. But behind her, the air warped. From the smeared trail emerged a figure, no longer a projection, no longer abstract. It wore a human face, but one half-finished, like an artist had given up midway through sculpting thought into flesh. The mouth moved constantly, muttering every word it had ever heard in a dozen languages simultaneously. Eyes blinked in sequences that defied rhythm. Elara raised one of the oubliette plates like a shield. The entity flinched, but did not retreat, and reached out. Where its hand passed, the world forgot. The floor ceased to exist. The lights blinked out not with darkness, but with absence. A wrench on the floor turned into a non-tool, a piece of nothing, no longer real, conceptually erased. Liu stumbled back, screaming. His creature lunged. Elara acted. She dove at the console in the vault's core, smashing open the mainframe and pulling loose a steel canister labeled Cognitive Dampener Active Core. Without hesitation, she twisted the dial and activated it. A shriek tore through the room, not from the creature, but from the concept of it. The air shimmered. Language collapsed into static. The thing reeled as pieces of its existence crumbled mid-thought. It screeched in backwards phonemes, clawing at its own vanishing identity. Then it imploded, not in flame or gore, but in forgetting. It simply wasn't there anymore. Elara dropped to her knees. Liu crawled toward her, wheezing. They sat in the silence, the core pulsing in Elara's hand. "I think," Elara said, voice hoarse, "I understand what this place is." Liu looked at her, blood still drying on her face. "This isn't an island," Elara whispered. "It's a thought, a sentient, hostile idea. SCP-3125 was never just contained here." She looked up, eyes wide with dawning horror. "It is the island." End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Cognitive Storm. The island convulsed, not with seismic tremors, but with perceptual ruptures. As Elara and Liu staggered back into the lightless jungle, reality around them warped with each step. Trees elongated into scribbled sketches when unobserved, then snapped back into dimension when glanced at directly. The sky bled language, clouds forming sentences in forgotten tongues before vanishing into static. Their minds pulsed with pressure, like a migraine trying to escape through the skull. The cognitive dampener Elara clutched buzzed faintly in her pack, leaking a field of mental silence around them, a bubble of half-sanity in an environment that hated comprehension. The jungle now watched them. Leaves shifted as they passed, not in the wind, but in curiosity. They walked through glades that smelled of printer ink and decay. Trees bore inscriptions in throbbing runes that echoed back any thought with poisonous inversion. Think, safety, feel, trap, think, truth, receive, lie. They were being read. "Have to get to the central vault," Elara rasped, pointing toward a jagged hill that rose like a broken tooth in the jungle's center. "That's where the containment core is, the true core. If there's a way to reseal SCP-3125, it's there." Liu nodded, pale and shaking, her blood-soaked bandage seeping through. They hiked in silence for half a mile, until they came upon a stone archway wrapped in fleshy vines. Beneath it, carved into the stone, was a line of script that made their eyes water just from looking. Elara whispered, "This is where they stored the script, the one that sealed it the first time." They passed through. The interior was a cathedral of language. Walls stretched into infinity, carved top to bottom with runes and symbols. Stacks of books hovered mid-air, pages flipping themselves. Pools of ink moved against gravity, slithering toward thoughts not yet formed. At the center stood a plinth. On it, a manuscript bound in red sinew. Its title shimmered. "The Tempest Within." Elara froze. "No," she whispered. "It can't be." She reached out and touched the cover. The world shifted. The jungle vanished. The stone beneath her feet melted into sand. Thunder crashed above. Waves pounded invisible shores. They were no longer in the ruins. They were inside the play. The island had written a script, an artificial narrative built from borrowed thoughts. A trap, it was the Tempest, but rewritten. Before them stood Prospero, not Shakespeare's noble mage, but a decaying marionette of thought, strung together by phrases and memories stolen from broken minds. His robe was stitched from pages, his staff a spinal column engraved with grammar. "You sought the storm," he hissed, voice fragmented like radio static, "but thought was the ocean all along." With a wave of his staff, the sky split open. Not clouds, ideas, thousands of them, each one arm shrieking, forming chains of logic that screamed in paradox. Liu clutched her head, collapsing as equations scrawled themselves across her arms like stigmata. Prospero advanced, speaking in voices not his own. SCP-3125 is not a being, it is a performance. It requires interpretation. It demands an audience. And you have listened. Elara activated the dampener, holding it aloft. The false Prospero screamed as pieces of his form flickered, his pages curling, his staff splintering into verb fragments. But he lunged. His fingers pierced Liu's abdomen. Her body seized. She arched backwards with a wet snap, blood fountaining from her mouth, not red, but ink-black, filled with floating letters. Her eyes rolled back as her mind was overwritten, erased, rewritten, performed. "Elara," she gurgled, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide. Her voice was no longer hers. It echoed in chorus, lines from the false script pouring forth like venom. "To dream in this place is to die awake, and to speak is to create the knife that cuts you. To think is to murder your own name." Elara screamed and drove a shard of the oublet plate through Liu's chest. Her friend's body shuddered. The air ruptured around her, and her form disintegrated. Not exploded, not decayed, just ceased. Elara sobbed, covered in ink blood, holding the dying dampener. Prospero turned his hollow gaze upon her, smiling, with a face that was now Liu's. "Story's end," he whispered. "But mine is only just beginning." With a final scream of fury and grief, Elara grabbed the Tempest Within, tore open the manuscript, and began reciting the oubliette script aloud, using the anti-hanglat, the non-thoughts. Reality cracked. The cathedral exploded inwards, sucking Prospero, the pages, the air, even gravity itself, into a collapsing loop of inverted logic. And Elara fell out through birds. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The Mine Cage. Elara hit the ground with a sickening crunch, ribs folding inward like wet paper. Her scream was swallowed by the floor itself, muffled, as if the world around her didn't want to hear pain. She lay twisted on a cold obsidian surface, the taste of iron and ink thick in her mouth, eyes unfocused, blood seeping into the seams of a reality that felt more imagined than physical. This wasn't the jungle, it wasn't the ruins, it wasn't even the play anymore. She had fallen into the mind of SCP-3125. Everything here was language. The horizon was made of sentences stacked into mountains. The sky bled metaphors in purple rivers. Giant punctuation marks floated like birds of prey overhead, circling her with beady semicolon eyes. The air vibrated with unsaid things. As Elara crawled to her knees, the ground beneath her responded, shifting from black obsidian to parchment, then back again. Her movements scrawled involuntary sentences beneath her feet. She should not have come. And she opened the door. She is the ink. She is the pen. The thoughts weren't her own anymore. She stood, staggering, body broken but upright, and screamed into the sentence sky. "I am not your author!" The world shuddered. From the horizon, something rose. Not walked, not ran. Rose like thought emerging into realization. It was her, but not her. A duplicate. Formed from idea rather than flesh. Hair moving like smoke. Skin like reflective text, constantly rewriting itself with fragments of her memories, birthdays, heartbreaks, discoveries, losses. Its eyes were hollow quotation marks, and it smiled with a mouth full of ellipses. This was 3125 Elara. Her mind, rewritten in the entity's script. It approached, and as it moved, the ground beneath it bled syntax. Verbs dripped from its feet. It left trails of unfinished paragraphs in its wake. "You are the author and the authored," it said, voice like crumpled paper and breaking glass. "You came seeking knowledge, but you carried the ink within you all along." It raised a hand, fingers stretching into a quill, and wrote into her chest. The pain was beyond nerve, beyond bone. It was conceptual agony. Her identity unwrote itself line by line, favorite colors, her first kiss. The name of the cat she'd buried when she was 8. All erased, overwritten, with alien definitions. She screamed, thrashing, blood and ink spraying in tandem from her eyes and mouth. But then, from her pocket, the final plate of the oubliette script pulsed. Weak, faint, but present. With trembling fingers, Elara reached into her coat, pulled the plate out, and pressed it against her forehead, where the entity had begun to carve her new name. The moment metal touched skin, the world shrieked. The false Elara recoiled, her face distorting into a kaleidoscope of failing identities. "You cannot define me," Elara roared, standing tall, blood pouring down her front. "I choose what I am." The words ignited the air. The skies cracked. Sentence mountains crumbled. The quotation, birds exploded into punctuation shrapnel. The false Elara screamed, her body disintegrating into loose fragments of thought, clauses, verbs, phonemes, falling apart mid-sentence. Elara grabbed one of the fragments, a single black word, unmake, and slammed it into the ground. The mind cage shattered. She fell again, through layers of dissolving language, through the collapsing mind of SCP-3125, through the dying fragments of its cognitive ecosystem, until there was nothing but blankness, and breath, and blood, and her. She awoke in the ruins, beneath the broken dome, beneath a sky no longer whispering. The jungle was silent. The plates around her were scorched, melted into the stone. SCP-3125 had been pushed back, not destroyed, but contained. Again. At a price. Elara looked at her reflection in the glass of a shattered terminal. Her eyes were no longer hers. Inside them, language writhed. And deep within her, something waited. Watching. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. To Unthink a God. Elara stood at the threshold of annihilation, her blood-soaked coat clinging to her like a molting skin. The jungle behind her whispered no more. Its trees stood still and breathless, terrified into silence by the storm that had broken inside her. Her footsteps echoed hollowly on the cracked stone path leading to the island's heart, an altar of thought, a monolith not of stone, but of intention. It rose in a perfect black cylinder, smooth and seamless, untouched by wind or erosion, humming with the dissonant vibration of a mind that should not exist. At its base was a doorway. No hinges, no handle. It opened with recognition. As she approached, the door inhaled her thoughts. A breath of memory, and the surface melted into mist. She stepped inside. The interior defied architecture. It was a space built by cognition, for cognition. A chamber sculpted from mental architecture. Walls that bent inward toward infinite vanishing points. Impossible loops of staircases made from language fragments. Floors textured with embedded syntax. It pulsed with awareness. It saw her. At its center stood the core. A suspended sphere of vibrating anti-thought, pure unmeaning, the cognitive equivalent of antimatter. It rotated silently, tethered by streams of light that weren't beams but sentences, statements etched in real time into the void. Above it, the air shimmered. SCP-3125 had arrived. It manifested not as a beast nor a being, but as an idea given weight. It hovered, a writhing storm of contradictory concepts. Its face was a book, bound shut with razor wire, and its body was a lattice of unreadable glyphs, spinning too fast to comprehend. Its limbs were made of broken definitions. Wherever it looked, meaning died. Elara felt it probe her. It reached into her skull, flipping through her memories like a well-worn journal. And then it spoke. But not aloud. Had it inserted its voice directly into her thoughts. You dream of containing me? Eerie. I am the scream that rewrites, the word that forgets itself. I am already inside you. She dropped to her knees as the voices returned, Liu screaming, Mateo dissolving, Caspar clawing his face, all layered atop each other, looping, recursive, fractal. She screamed. Blood gushed from her ears. Her brain felt wet, like a sponge run too many times. But then clarity. Amidst the pain, she remembered something from the script, a line buried deep. To destroy the thought, become its contradiction. She rose, spitting blood, and reached into her coat. From her satchel she pulled the core of the cognitive dampener, now cracked, its glow dim. And from her own blood she painted glyphs on her forearms, her own script, one built on refusal, denial, the anti-thought. Not silence, not ignorance, defiance. SCP-3125 reared in fury, its shape twisting into a spiral of letters meant to overwrite her. Sentences screamed across its surface. You are an unfinished sentence. I am the period. Elara stepped forward and spoke. I am the typo you cannot correct. And she lunged into the core. Pain. It was beyond sensation. Her body ceased to be. She was stripped to thought, her mind folded inside out, every part of her life rewritten 1,000 times per second. But she held on. To herself. To a single sentence. I am not your story. The core exploded. Reality collapsed inward. Language detonated like napalm. The mental construct imploded, tearing SCP-3125's form into unstrung metaphors and decaying definitions. It shrieked, its scream unreadable, a mass of letters, melting mid-air. It thrashed, shedding limbs made of verbs and thoughts. Elara reached into its writhing form and forced the broken core into its center. "On things," she whispered. And SCP-3125 was unthought. The storm vanished. The chamber dissolved. The sentence ended. She awoke alone, lying in the dust at the foot of the monolith, which was now inert stone. The island was quiet. The wind returned. The trees breathed. And for the first time since stepping onto that cursed land, her thoughts were her own. But she knew it wasn't over. Inside her, something still lingered. Not SCP-3125. The knowledge of how to kill it. The knowledge to become it. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. The Blank Page. The boat was waiting. A miracle. Or a curse. Either way, Elara found it tethered to a warped stone dock at the island's edge, where the water rippled not with tide, but with nervous anticipation. The sea was too still, too obedient. It reflected nothing, not even her. Like it, she had become unreadable. She stepped aboard. Every movement felt hollow, as if gravity forgot her weight. Her limbs carried bruises etched deep, bone deep, but her skin bore no scars, only faint markings that shimmered when her mind drifted towards certain thoughts. Glyphs, like fingerprints of the entity she had destroyed, or had become. The motor choked once, coughed, then roared to life. Behind her, the island receded, but not physically. It unmade itself. Trees collapsed into rootless thoughts. Rocks turned to dust without origin. The monolith split and crumbled, its glyphs swirling upward like smoke, disintegrating into the sky. The entire landmass collapsed into abstraction. It hadn't been a place. It had been a concept. Now, unheld, it ceased to be. Elara looked down at her hands as she crossed into international waters. One of her fingers was missing. No Tuanav never existed. She could no longer recall if she'd had 10 to begin with. 6 months later, in a subterranean lab beneath Geneva, Dr. Elara Voss sat at a terminal surrounded by reams of documentation. No one asked about her scars, the ones on her thoughts. No one questioned why she returned alone. The Foundation, or what was left of it, was desperate, terrified, starved for answers. And she had answers. They hadn't dared to ask her to explain SCP-3125. No one could say its name anymore. They referred to it in blank documents, in redacted memos, in silence. But she knew. She carried it. One of the researchers, a junior linguist, approached her one evening. He placed a folder on her desk. "You left this in the vault," he said, eyes downcast. "Your notes, the ones that survived." She opened the file. Inside, handwritten on coarse paper, was her own script. But it had changed. It was writing itself, ink bleeding slowly across the surface, new symbols forming. Patterns she hadn't written, a sentence mid-construction. "You are the last line before the epilogue." She dropped the file. Her pulse surged. The linguist backed away. "Dr. Voss?" he asked. She looked at him, really looked, and saw it in his eyes. Recognition. He had read something. A sleever. A whisper. Enough. His body spasmed. A thin line of red ran from his nostrils. He fell backward, hitting the floor with a crack. His limbs twitched once, then went still. Blood pooled under him, not red. Elara stood. Alarms blared. Guards rushed the hall, but their eyes widened as they looked at her, not in fear, not in confusion, or standing. And that was the final mistake. Each one dropped, twitching, screaming, half-sentences before their voices bled into static. One by one, their language turned against them, cutting through them like shattered glass. Their last thoughts dissolved mid-formation. She watched. Still. Empty. Later, she sat alone in the briefing room, lights flickering overhead. Cameras trained on her trembled, pixelated, then ceased transmitting. Every file referencing her name blinked from the server, one by one. In her lap rested a single notebook, untouched. Blank. She opened it and began to write. With each line, a thought died somewhere. With each word, a piece of the world was rewritten. She was not SCP-3125. She was its successor, the one who understood the storm, the one who learned to think it forward. As she dipped the pen in a pool of black that was neither ink nor blood, she smiled softly and wrote, "This is the beginning of the next island.